G'day, I'm Peter.
And g'day, I'm Greg.
Welcome to Today's Stories from Our Past, a podcast about a history of Australia from about 1800 onwards.
By 1851, the area known as the Burra was the seventh most populated area on the continent, with a population of 5,000. The workforce at the monster mine exceeded 1,000. By late 1852, employee numbers had dropped to under 100. An epidemic had swept through the town. Gold fever had taken them all.
Okay, but what's that got to do with your ancestors down in Adelaide?
Well, a few of my ancestors caught the fever as well, and this is a story of how they got from South Australia to the Goldfields.
All right. So which ancestors are you talking about?
William Henry Neale and his extended family. A quick recap. My great-great-great-grandfather, William Henry Neale, had been declared bankrupt in England in 1835, owing £6,000. That's about 1.8 million Australian dollars today. And although he had no relevant skills, he obtained the job of assistant surveyor to Colonel Light. William and his family came out to the fledgling colony on board the Cygnet with George Strickland Kingston and other members of the surveying team. William helped Colonel Light peg out the streets of Adelaide, but Light soon became aware of William's lack of skills, and William's surveying career was over. After a stint as an auctioneer and general agent, William, along with many other merchants in the new colony, was declared bankrupt in 1841. This time he owed £6,511.
Right. Do you know what happened to William after his bankruptcy?
Well, by 1851, William had a large family, consisting of William, his wife Mary, 2 sons and 5 daughters. The 2 sons were Harry and Samuel. The daughters were Mary, Frances, known as Fanny, Elizabeth, Charlotte and Rose. William was still in South Australia. The records are scant, but William got an occupation licence on 1 July 1847 near Burra Hill. He called his property Kurramurra. An occupation licence meant that he did not own the land, but he could use it for pastoral purposes, meaning grazing sheep or cattle.
Do you know where Kurramurra was?
Well, it took me forever to get a good location for Kurramurra. Burra Hill is about 15 kilometres south of modern-day Burra, so I had a general idea of where his property would have been. But then a series of fortunate events occurred. I told a friend we were looking for it, and he said he knew someone who owned a property south of Burra. My mate put me in contact with that person, and, as it happened, I'd met that bloke some 10 years earlier. I contacted him, and he said he knew where the remains of the Kurramurra cottage were, but all that remained of the original building was just a pile of rubble on the banks of Burra Creek. I should point out that all buildings around the Burra mine were, and still are, made of stone, often quite rough-cut stone. This is the legacy of the limited timber in the area and the significant population of Cornish miners at the Burra mine, who would build stone cottages and even fence lines as a sideline. So, after some back and forth, we arranged to visit the property. The owner, who is a top bloke, took us to the site. At first glance, it did seem just like a pile of old rubble, but we decided to go into time team mode. We put up our drone and looked down from above. The rectangular shapes of 3 small buildings emerged from within the strewn rocks. With this information, we more closely re-examined the rubble, and then we could clearly see the alignment of wall foundations. The property owner explained that the practice in those early days was, if somebody moved away from their cottage, anyone could come along and remove all the wall stones for their own use. So often, the wall footings were all that remained. We were sure that we had found the Kurramurra cottage and its outbuildings. It was a most surreal feeling standing on the site where, 180 years earlier, my ancestors had lived. We could not have thanked the property owner enough.
Did William make enough income from Kurramurra to support his large family?
No, I don't know how large his occupation licence was, but I do know that by 1851, William worked at the Burra mine, which was also called the Monster Mine. Just some quick background about the Burra mine. Copper was discovered in the area in August 1845. Shepherds, William Streer and Thomas Pickett discovered outcrops of copper close to the Burra Creek. Soon after, a similar find was made by another shepherd further to the north. News of the discovery reached Adelaide, a town already infected with a mining mania because of the success of the recently opened Kapunda copper mine.
That sounds a bit like a gold rush.
Certainly was. And the struggle for possession of this new copper-bearing land quickly followed. A special survey of 20,000 acres was undertaken, and it was divided between two groups. One was the South Australian Mining Association and the other, the Princess Royal Mining Association. On 29 September 1845, the South Australian Mining Association began mining operations at the Burra mine. By 1848, the mine employed over 500 miners. In 1850, dividends paid to shareholders reached a staggering 800% of their initial investment. By 1851, the locality, simply known as the Burra, was the seventh most populated area on the continent, with a population of over 5,000, and it was the largest inland settlement in Australia. For 15 years, the mine supplied 89% of South Australia's and 5% of the world's copper.
Well, that mine sure had a large workforce, and I don't think they would have had fly-in, fly-out workers at that time, so my guess is the town grew nearby.
Yep, you're dead right. The current town of Burra began in 1846, but it was originally called Coringa. Coringa was owned, surveyed and built by the South Australian Mining Association. It was the first such company town in Australia and remained so until the closure of the mine. George Strickland Kingston was responsible for laying out Coringa. If you remember from episode 3, George Strickland Kingston and the Neale family all came out to the colony in 1836 on the ship the Cygnet. The hills around Coringa and the mine area were soon stripped of their trees to supply timber for the mine works. Coringa today is known as Burra South and is the main part of modern-day Burra. It's unclear to me whether the family was living near the mine at Coringa or if they were living 12 kilometres away on the occupation licence at Kurramurra. I suspect they lived in town as it would have been a long commute every day.
Okay, so William had a job, and this would have been unlikely to produce enough income to pay off his bankruptcy debts and support a large family. So what options were open to William?
Well, if you know anything at all about Australia's history, you'd know that the great gold rushes happened in the 1850s and that Melbourne became one of the richest cities in the world.
All right, guys, there goes some gold right there.
So William got the gold fever?
He sure did. And I'm lucky to know how and when William got to the goldfields.
Don't tell me that William Henry Neale wrote his personal reminiscences like your other ancestor John Watts.
No, William didn't write anything like that. Well, as far as I know, he didn't. But William and his family, plus a few ring-ins, trekked overland from Burra to the goldfields at Bendigo. By 1852, two of William's daughters had married. Both of their husbands were part of the trekking convoy, and they kept daily diaries of the trek. I have copies of both diaries, which are entitled An Overland Journey from Kurramurra, South Australia to Bendigo, Victoria. One is written by James O'Donoghue, the other by William Emmett. The diaries are written in short notes with abbreviations. We'll use excerpts from the diaries that have been slightly altered so that their meaning is clear. I should also point out that both Bill and James wrote their diaries in the third person.
Okay, well, you'd better tell me about these blokes.
Let's start with William Abbott Emmett. To avoid confusion with the name William Henry Neale, we'll call William Emmett Bill from now on. Bill was born on 22 November 1823 in Hobart, Tasmania. His father, Harry, married Mary Townsend in 1808, and they subsequently had 11 children in 14 years. Bill's father died, aged 66, in 1848. One of Bill's older brothers, Edward Newseller Emmett, known as Ned, moved from Tasmania to Adelaide in 1840 and had set up an auctioneering business there. Unlike William Henry Neale, Ned didn't go bankrupt when the crash came in Adelaide in 1841-42. Then, another brother, George Grindle Emmett, joined Ned in South Australia and started farming in the Lindock Valley. Unfortunately, by 1847, George had gone broke. On 22 March 1849, Ned married Sarah Blackham in Adelaide, and his business was prospering. Bill Emmett can tell us in his own words what happened. This account is not from the Trek Diary, but from other family archives.
At the age of 18, I left Tasmania and sailed for Adelaide, which by this time had attained some importance. My brother, Edward Emmett, had opened a store there and was doing well. He sent for me to come and assist him. Edward Emmett had a farm of 600 acres which he rented from the South Australian Company. I was given the management of this farm and put 400 acres of it under cereal crops. However, after paying men to reap by hand and threshing by horse workers, we could not make the farm pay. My big brother and a Mr. Ridley, putting their heads together, invented the stripping machine, which has now been improved into the combine harvester. For a first attempt, the stripper was a marvel of ingenuity. The comb and beaters were practically the same as they are today, very little room for improvement being left. The machine was drawn by bullocks. The comb was raised or lowered by means of a long pole, which projected from behind. The stripper made a thoroughly good job of the threshing, and when the box receptacle behind the drum became full, it was emptied onto a tarpaulin where the winnowers were stationed. I was the man that worked this stripper on its trial and subsequently through the 400 acres. I well remember the first day I started. We were very much afraid there would be trouble from the hand reapers, about 50, who all lay down their reap hooks and came to view the machine at work. Some were for breaking the stripper, but by judiciously persuading, the men were induced to return to their work. After a couple of years farming with my brother, I took a farm from the South Australian Company on my own account and did as well as could be expected under the conditions. There was no land for sale or selection at the time of which I write, the South Australian Company having a charter of the colony. After paying rent and other expenses, I very seldom had any profit left. At this time, 1847, I became tired of bachelorhood and married Miss Neale, eldest daughter of William Henry Neale, of whom a word later on.
Hang on, didn't we say in episode 15 that John Ridley developed the stripper by himself? And now Bill Emmett's claiming that his brother Ned jointly developed the stripper with Ridley. Do you know what's going on here?
Yeah, Bill's story there doesn't seem quite right. So I went back to the early South Australian newspapers to see what actually happened. Firstly, there is no doubt that Ned Emmett and John Ridley knew each other. In October 1842, they occupied the same building. Secondly, at this time there was considerable interest in finding a machine that could mechanically reap wheat crops to replace the existing, labour-intensive and costly method of hand reaping. A reaping machine was needed. On 5 September 1843, a newspaper advertised that
on Tuesday evening, according to announcement, the Market Committee held a meeting at the Auction Mart Tavern for the purpose of arranging with the inventors of reaping machines in reference to their exhibition for the benefit of the public, and as to the reward to be bestowed for the best machines.
So, the need for a reaping machine had been identified, and a reward was being offered for the best design. Several people proposed ideas for such a machine. At the meeting, the newspaper noted that
Messrs. Herbert, Smith, Emmett and others exhibited plans, but we are unable to describe the inventions.
Okay. So Ned Emmett had plans for a stripper, but he didn't have a working model.
Yeah, just plans. Soon after, a newspaper reported that
On Tuesday, 19th September, 2 adaptations of the ancient mode of thrashing were presented to the reaping committee. One of them was by Mr. Emmett on behalf of Mr. King of Gawler Town, who proposed to cut off the ears by revolving knives. The other was by Mr. Bull, who proposed revolving beaters, being in fact the same principle as had been mentioned by Mr. Ridley in the Register of 2nd September. At the time, however, that Mr. Bull brought forward his plan, Mr. Ridley's machine was nearly constructed.
Okay. In other words, Ned Emmett had just had the plans for a stripper when John Ridley had already just about built his machine.
Yeah, this is a classic example of how you need to fact-check everything. While memoirs are particularly useful, sometimes they can overstate the accomplishments of the author. Clearly, Bill Emmett is overstating the accomplishments of his brother Ned. And there's something else that Bill's got wrong. He says that he married William Henry Neale's daughter in 1847. In fact, they married on the 23rd of March, 1850.
Well, that's a bit slack, and Bill can't even remember the date of his wedding anniversary. So how was his brother Ned going?
Well, things aren't going too well for Ned. Like his brother George, Ned was declared bankrupt. By 1850, legal proceedings had started. To compound matters, Ned's 7-month-old son died in November of that year. By 1851, the legal proceedings against Ned were still unresolved, so he took action. The following is from Ned's 1874 obituary.
It is with very much regret that we have to announce the death of one of the earliest pioneers of this goldfield, Mr. Edward Newseller Emmett, who expired yesterday morning in Sydney from the effects of an apoplectic fit with which he was attacked a few days ago. Mr. Emmett arrived on Bendigo from Adelaide early in 1852 and for a short time employed himself in digging, chiefly in Ironbark Gully, where he found some valuable quartz specimens and may be said to have been the first discoverer of the Hustler's Reef.
So Ned scarpered off to the Victorian Goldfields and one of the first there.
Yeah, and from what I can determine from the legal proceedings, the people to whom he owed money were happy enough with this outcome. Ned striking it rich on the goldfields was probably their only way of getting him to pay off his debts.
I do have one query here. Victoria wasn't the only place in the world to have a gold rush. After all, the most famous gold rush was in California in 1849. The miners were the fabulous 49ers. If George Emmett went broke in 1847, why didn't he go to California and then Ned could have followed him there?
That's a good question. And yes, George did head off to California. Despite some varied newspapers' reports about the Californian gold rush in Adelaide papers, George Emmett left Adelaide on 10 January 1850 for the California rush on board the Pauline.
Okay, so how did George fare in California?
Not so good. Here's a report that appeared in the Launceston Examiner on 26 October 1850.
Deaths. At California, early in June, 13 days after his arrival in the Pauline from Adelaide, Mr. George Emmett, aged 36.
Okay, I can see why they didn't go to California. So Ned must have told Bill back in South Australia about his luck on the Bendigo Goldfields.
Yeah, because not long after, Bill Emmett, James O'Donoghue, who we'll meet soon, and William Henry Neale's oldest son Harry rode across to the goldfields. Their overland journey took 5 weeks. Bill goes on to say,
And only a few years later, in 1850, news arrived of the discovery of gold in Victoria. As I had mentioned, there was very little opportunity of making money out of farming, so I, accompanied with my brother-in-law Harry Neale and Mr. James O'Donoghue, decided to start overland for the Goldfields. We were one of the first gold fever parties who left South Australia, but followed in our wake were every man that could get away. Most of the people went via Melbourne, but I think very few arrived on the fields before we did. More than half of the houses in the farming district of South Australia were empty. 6 or 7 married women whose husbands had left for the fields would be found living in one house. They did this as a means of protection from unwelcome visitors.
It is correct that Bill married Mary Elizabeth Neale, William Henry Neale's oldest daughter, on 23 March 1850 in Adelaide. Bill and Mary would go on to have 12 children in the next 16 years. Their first child was William Henry, known as Willie, born on 17 April 1851.
Okay. However, based on the story about the stripper, it seems we need to fact-check whatever Bill says.
Yep, you're right there. After their marriage in 1850, Bill and Mary went on to reside at the Little Burra River in the Mount Barker Ranges. But soon after, Bill and Mary moved to Burra, where Mary's father, William Henry Neale, was working in the monster mine. It's likely that Bill Emmett ran cattle on Kurramurra while William Henry Neale worked at the mine.
Okay. So Bill Emmett's now married into the Neale clan. Now you'd better tell me about this other fella, James O'Donoghue.
James O'Neill O'Donoghue was the son of Thomas O'Donoghue. Thomas was born in Ireland, but as a young man he joined the British Army and subsequently spent 25 years in India, where he married. Thomas's life in India and subsequent return to England, followed by a move to Tasmania, is a long and interesting story, which we'll cover in later episodes. Thomas and his wife Elizabeth had 10 children, with James being their 8th child. James' birth on 20 August 1820 was registered in Fort William, Calcutta, where his father was based. But the family story is that he was born at sea on a trip back from Singapore. Thomas O'Donoghue was put on half pay from the army in 1825 and was granted a large area of land near Oyster Bay in Tasmania. Thomas and his family arrived in Hobart in 1828, accompanied by another army family, the Stammers. Thomas O'Donoghue passed away in 1831 in Port Sorrel at the age of 53. James was only 10 years old when his father died. James's mother passed away in 1843 in Hobart at the age of 57. By then, James was 23 years old. So, subsequently, James and his friend, J.J. Stammers, went over to Victoria looking for work. I can't find out where and when James O'Donoghue meets Bill Emmett, but by 1850, James had moved to the Burra. Then, as I said, in early 1852, Bill Emmett, James O'Donoghue, and William Henry Neale's oldest son Harry rode across to the Goldfields. Subsequently, Harry Neale stayed in Bendigo, probably with Ned Emmett, while Bill Emmett and James O'Donoghue returned to South Australia by ship. They departed Melbourne on 26 June and arrived in Adelaide on 4 July 1852. They then went straight up to the Burra.
Okay, so Bill Emmett and James O'Donoghue arrived in Burra in July 1852 with news of the gold rush in Bendigo. So how did the extended Neale family get to the rush?
Well, part of the news that Bill and James brought back from the Goldfields was that there was a shortage of bullocks and other heavy livestock there. They heard that good draft horses were selling in Bendigo from 50 to 60 pounds each, and saddle horses from 20 to 30 pounds each. So they came up with a cunning plan. They put together a party including several bullock drivers with their teams to trek overland to Bendigo. Once there, they would sell the draft animals and start life on the goldfields with money in their pockets. Here's an extract from Bill Emmett's trek diary describing the group.
There were 19 people in the party. I think it nothing but right that I should say who made up the 19. namely Mr. William Henry Neale, William Emmett, James O'Donoghue and their wives, Elizabeth, Charlotte and Helen Neale, also a boy, Sam Neale, Dr. Lloyd, Mr. Hennell and Charlie, a French lad who ran away from his ship and was at the Burra mines with William Henry Neale. Charlie travelled nearly all the way over with us, and a stranger overtaking us with a lead horse induced Charlie to go with him, giving him the led horse to ride, so Charlie made a bolt of it for the second time. Next, bullock drivers Abe, Joe, Chunky and Lad. Also, a bullock driver named Five-Fingered Jack and William Emmett's little son, Willie. 19 in all. Now, I suppose you would like to know how bullock driver Jack came by the name of Five-Fingered Jack. It was in this way. He met with an accident, so he had 4 fingers on one hand and 1 finger on the other, and was always known as Five-Fingered Jack ever afterwards.
So they put together a party of 19 people to trek across to the Goldfields. Could you give us a bit more detail about these people?
Okay. The 19 people consisted of 4 adult women, 4 children, that's under 18, and 11 working men. There was William Henry Neale, aged 52, who was known amongst the group as the Governor, and his wife Mary, aged 50. Their unmarried children were son Samuel, aged 8, and daughters Elizabeth, 18, Charlotte, 14, and Rose, 11. Then there's Bill Emmett, aged 29, and his wife Mary, aged 23, and their young son Willie, just 14 months old at the start of the trek. And Mary was pregnant at the start of their journey. The diary notes that James O'Donoghue, who was 32, had got married just a short time before the start of the journey. James married Fanny Neale, another one of William Henry Neale's daughters, on 17 July 1852 in the Church of St Mary in Burra. Fanny was 21. Now that's only a fortnight after the lads have got back from the Goldfields. The Church of St Mary was erected on a site donated by the South Australian Mining Company on the southwest corner of Church and Ware Streets. The church was later replaced by the current St Mary's Church of England, located in Market Street, Burra.
Do you know anything about the rest of the party?
Well, firstly, Dr. Lloyd. After a bit of digging, I found out that Dr. Charles Lloyd had arrived in South Australia on the Dorset from Sydney on 2 January 1849. By 1852, Dr. Lloyd had been working at the Burra mine as a doctor there for some time. On 11 November 1851, Charles Lloyd married Annie Gregg in Burra. Sadly, just 8 months later, on 5 July 1852, Charles Lloyd's wife Annie died of consumption. You'd have to think that the tragic death of his wife might have been the trigger for Charles to throw in his job at the mine and head over to the Goldfields with the extended Neale family.
Well, that's sad. Perhaps he was looking for a fresh start over there. My guess is that you could make good money as a doctor on the Goldfields rather than just joining the diggers. Anything else?
Well, Mr. Hennell is Henry Holford Hennell, aged 24. He was a nephew of James O'Donoghue. Henry had arrived in the colony of South Australia on the Jenny Lind on 13 June 1850, having sailed from Plymouth. My guess is that he was hoping to have the colonial experience, as it was called at the time, with his Uncle James. Unfortunately, I can't find anything at all about the backstories of the bullock drivers.
Okay, so they put together this party of 19 people. What happened next?
Well, they start preparing for their journey. In his diary, Bill Emmett writes,
Monday, the 2nd of August. Preparations and starting for an overland journey from Cunning, South Australia to Bendigo, Victoria, between 500 and 600 miles. Party all told, 19. William Emmett and James O'Donoghue just having returned from the Victorian Goldfields. The next day, after our arrival, went up to Dan O'Leary's public house, where we knew there were 4 teams of bullocks for sale. purchased the lot at a fair price, all complete with the exception of one of the drays which had the pole broken, and one of the men called it the Polly dray, and it was always called by that name until it was sold in Victoria.
Now, a quick word about Dan O'Leary's public house. It was also called the Sod Hut Inn, or simply just the Sod Hut. It was about 12 kilometres, that's about 8 miles, south of Burra on what was then the road to Adelaide. Bullock drays carried copper ore from the Monster Mine to Port Adelaide and returned with supplies. A fully laden bullock dray travelled about 8 to 10 miles in one day, so the Sod Hut was conveniently located 1 day's travel from Burra. The teamsters would stop at the Sod Hut for the night, where they would generously partake in refreshments while their bullocks teams rested. From all accounts, it was a crude affair, run by this Irishman Dan O'Leary. Today, the ruins of the Sod Hut are visible beside the Cunning Road, about 12k south of Burra. Bill Emmett then describes more about their preparations. He writes,
Tuesday, 3rd August. All hands fixing up the drays. 4 hoops on each dray. Horse dray and spring cart all had hoops, then an old blanket for lining and stout tarpaulin over each one. A very busy day it was. Wednesday, 4th August. Commenced loading. 1 or 2 drays were partly finished, and while the loading was proceeding, William Henry Neale arranged with an extraordinary short fat man called Chunky, who had 2 teams of bullocks, to carry for us half a ton of goods in each of his drays over to Bendigo, and he and his hired boy had their rations with our men in payment for his work, which enabled him to get to the goldfields without costing him anything. This made up the 6 bullock drays. Chunky had a cask of port at least 600 weight. Also, a cask of beef about the same weight and various other things. Long rope and 2 porter hogsheads for crossing the drays over the Murray River when we came to the crossing place. Chunky arrived with his 2 drays in the evening, and while the drays were getting their finishing touch, William Henry Neale, James O'Donoghue and Henry Hennell, who was with us, were engaged in mustering the cattle, William Henry Neale having sold the run with all the cattle mustered by a certain date at £1 per head for the cattle, with the run given in.
Now, there's a lot of detail in this section that we'll need to explain, but firstly, having read lots of diaries and reminiscences written in the 19th century, I've noticed something. We need to consider what information they would have taken for granted at the time and not bothered to include in a diary. For example, let's say I was about to go on a long trip and I was going to keep a journal like Bill and James did. I might write in my journal that I sent an email to all my friends and family letting them know the details of my trip. I wouldn't bother explaining in my journal what an email was because, well, that's common knowledge. However, if somebody found my journal and read it in 100 years' time, they might wonder what an email was. The same happens in 18th century diaries. They don't specifically give some details because they assume that anyone reading their journal would have knowledge about the norms of the time.
Well, some information that I can help you with is that when Bill says hoops, he means putting an outer iron rim on the wooden wheels of the drays, and this was essential for travel over rough country. 4 hoops on each dray means that the drays had 2 axles, so they had large drays, not the smaller single-axle drays. Furthermore, once the iron rim was fitted onto the wooden wheel, it was said that the wheel was then entire or complete. Hence the iron rims became known as tyres, and that's actually the origin of the word we use today for rubber tyres.
Yes, and I've got another word for you that is derived from the days of the bullock wagon. A bullocky was sometimes accompanied by a young lad. In our story, the bullocky Chunky had a lad with him. The young lad would walk on the opposite side, called the offside, of the bullock team to the bullocky, keeping the offside bullocks up to their work. He became known as an offsider. Nowadays, the term offsider applies to anybody who helps. So, Greg, you're my offsider.
Okay, fair enough. So what is a hundredweight?
In the diary, Bill writes, a cask of port at least 6 CWT. CWT was the abbreviation for 100 weight, which in the wonderful imperial system was not 100 pounds. 100 weight was 112 pounds. So 600 weight is about 305 kilos. The load, 0.5 tons of goods in each of his drays, meant a load of about 500 kilos per dray.
Okay, and what about porter hogsheads?
Porter hogsheads refers to both the beer style and to the barrel. Specifically, the beer was a dark ale with a robust malt-forward flavour profile, which was traditionally shipped from England to India in large quantities. These were transported in large wooden barrels called hogsheads. A standardised hogshead was about 1.2 metres high and 76 centimetres in diameter at the head. It held about 250 litres, depending on the width in the middle.
Is that all they were taking with them?
Well, they never say how many bullocks they had, but a typical working team had 10 to 12 bullocks. So, being conservative, it's probable that they had at least 6 to 8 bullocks per dray. This means they would have had somewhere between 36 and 48 bullocks in total. It's now helpful to work out who was where when they were on the road. They say that they had a spring cart, and later on they say that it was drawn by a Timor pony. As Bill Emmett's wife was pregnant at the start of the trip, and she had a 14-month-old son with her, it's reasonable to guess that she would have been on the spring cart. With the spring undercarriage, this would have been the smoothest vehicle to ride in. She would have needed a driver. Let's say her father, William Henry Neale, drove the spring cart. Then they had 6 bullock wagons. Most bullock wagons didn't have any seating, and the bullocky walked beside them. So there would have been 6 walking bullockies. My guess is Abe, Joe, Chunky and his lad, also walking, Five Finger Jack, plus Bill Emmett and James O'Donoghue. The French lad, Charlie, probably was an offsider to one of the wagons. It's likely that all of these men had a horse, which would have been tethered to the back of each wagon. Then there's the horse dray. It would have had 4 to 6 horses. By process of elimination, it's likely that Henry Halford drove the wagon with William Henry Neale's wife Mary and daughter Fanny on board. The younger Neale children would have been spread across the various wagons. This leaves Dr. Lloyd, who probably rode his own horse.
Okay, is that all?
Not quite. In passing, later in the diaries, they mention that they had a dairy cow with them. Later they refer to cows plural. These cows would have been milked every day to provide milk for tea and for the children. After all, there were no supermarkets along the track. Many of the men would also have had a dog. The bullockies often had a well-trained dog who would nip at the heels of lazy bullocks. Later in the diaries, they specifically mention some dogs, particularly large dogs used for hunting kangaroos. Also, although they don't mention them, they probably had some chickens in wooden coops. The chickens would provide fresh eggs and meat.
Okay, so in summary, you're saying that there would have been 19 trekkers, 6 bullock wagons, a horse wagon and a spring cart, 36 to 48 bullocks, at least 10 to 15 horses, some dairy cows, numbers unknown, and a pack of dogs. And that group would have been quite a substantial convoy.
Yeah, this is no small group heading off towards the goldfields.
One last question. Have you checked the overall veracity of the diaries? How can you be sure that someone in the later generation simply made up a lot of this stuff?
Good question. I did find an obituary for one of the trekkers, James O'Donoghue. James died in 1885, and we'll discuss his life in later episodes. In his obit, There are many sections which appear to have been directly taken out of the diaries. This gives me confidence that the information that we're using wasn't made up generations after the event.
Okay. Well, it sounds like they're getting organised and have gathered a great team together. But how did they go?
You'll have to wait until our next episode, where we'll describe the first stage of the journey. It may not surprise you to know that they were not the only ones to have this idea. In early September 1852, a newspaper noted that
the price of copper has risen about £5 a tonne in the London market within the last week or two, in consequence of the news from South Australia that the miners had deserted the Burra mines to seek gold at the diggings.
by 1851, the area known as the Burra had become the 7th most populated area on the continent, with a population of 5,000, and the largest inland settlement in Australia. The workforce at the monster mine exceeded 1,000, with 378 at the smelting works and many other offsite workers. But by late 1852, employee numbers had dropped to under 100.
Wow, it looks like gold fever has really broken out.
Yes, indeed. So it's goodbye from me.
And it's goodbye from me. Thank you.